The wind in the Dakota Territory of 1889 was not a gentle thing. It was a sculptor of land and spirit, a relentless force that scraped the earth bare and carved lines of hardship onto the faces of the men and women who dared to call it home. It howled like a starved wolf in the winter, carrying curtains of blinding snow. And in the summer, it was the hot breath of a furnace, kicking up dust devils that danced like malevolent spirits across the plains. The land itself was a testament to endurance, a vast, unforgiving expanse of cracked earth, stubborn prairie grass, an endless sky that pressed down on a man, reminding him of his own insignificance. Survival here was not an achievement. It was a daily, grinding negotiation with God and dirt. This was the world of Wyatt. His ranch was an island in this sea of desolation. A small patch of order wrested from the chaos, inherited from a father who had been broken by this very same land. Wyatt, however, was made of sterner stuff, or perhaps he was simply broken in a different way. His shoulders were broad, honed by years in the cavalry and the ceaseless labor of running a ranch alone. His hands were thick with calluses, the skin cracked and stained with the memory of rope, iron, and soil. But it was his eyes that told the truest story. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and distant, holding a stillness that went beyond mere quiet. They had seen the flash of cannon fire, the fall of good men, and something worse, the hungry glow of a fire that had consumed his world. Love, for Wyatt, was a ghost. It had a name, Sarah. It had a scent, wild flowers and baking bread, and it had an end. A cold night 2 years ago, the smell of smoke, and the horrifying orange light that had painted the sky as his barn burned to the ground with his wife trapped inside. She had gone in to save a panicked mare, a creature she'd loved as much as any person. Wyatt had been miles away, chasing strays. By the time he returned, drawn by the pillar of smoke, there was nothing left but embers, a silence more deafening than any scream, and a hole in his soul that the wind now blew straight through. Since that night, he had worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, using exhaustion as a shield against memory. He tended his cattle, mended his fences, and spoke more to his horse than to any human being. The ranch was his penance, his fortress, and his tomb. He did not believe in second chances, and he certainly no longer believed in love. But loneliness was a practical problem. The winters were too long, the work too much for one man. Mending, cooking, the small domestic tasks that kept a home from crumbling into a bachelor's hovel. They were a drain on time and energy he needed for the cattle. It was this cold logic, not a longing of the heart, that led him to place an advertisement in an East Coast Gazette, a mail-order bride. It was a transaction, a partnership of necessity. He needed a pair of hands. She would need a home and a husband's protection. He expected a plain, sturdy woman, perhaps a widow herself, someone with few illusions and a strong back. The letter he received in response was a surprise. The penmanship was elegant, the paper finer than anything found in the local general store. It came from a woman named Clara, in New York. Her words were measured, devoid of the flowery prose he'd expected. She did not speak of love or romantic notions of the West. Instead, she wrote of seeking a quiet life, far from the judgments of a world that has taken everything from me. She mentioned a deep personal tragedy, the loss of a man she was to marry, a man she claimed was condemned by lies and taken by a cruel injustice. There was a weariness in her sentences, a shadow of pain that Wyatt, in his own way, recognized. She was not seeking a fairy tale. She was seeking refuge. He wrote back a single, sparse letter, describing the ranch, the work, and the harshness of the life. He offered her passage. He signed it simply. Wyatt. 2 months later, a telegram confirmed she was on her way. The journey west was a rattling, swaying, clattering purgatory for Clara. For days. The train was her entire world, its rhythmic chugging a constant pulse against the turmoil in her heart. She watched the green, crowded landscapes of the east bleed into the wide, open and intimidating emptiness of the plains. With every mile, she felt she was shedding a layer of her old life, a life of whispers, pointed fingers, and the crushing weight of a city that held nothing but ghosts for her. In a small reticule on her lap, her fingers constantly sought the comfort of a single object. A letter. It was not Wyatt's letter, but another one. Its paper soft and fragile from countless readings, the creases worn through in places. The ink was faded, the words a testament to a love that had ended in a nightmare. It was her most treasured possession and her heaviest burden. A link to the past she was fleeing but could never truly escape. She would stare out the window at the passing landscape, her hand clutching that tattered piece of paper, her knuckles white, her expression a mask of sorrow and resolve. When the train finally hissed to a stop at the dusty outpost that served as the nearest town to Wyatt's ranch, Clara stepped onto the platform and felt the full force of the West for the first time. The wind immediately whipped at her modest traveling dress, and the sun was a white-hot glare in a sky that seemed impossibly large. She saw him at once. He was taller than she had imagined, his frame lean and powerful under a worn duster. He stood apart from the few other men on the platform, a figure of stark solitude. When their eyes met, Clara felt a jolt. She had prepared herself for a hard man, but she had not been prepared for the profound loneliness she saw in his gaze. Wyatt, for his part, was taken aback. The woman standing before him was not the plain, weathered figure he had pictured. Clara was possessed of a quiet, simple beauty. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back neatly, but stray wisps had escaped to frame a face that was intelligent and composed. She was not frail, but there was a delicacy to her features. And then there were her eyes. They were a deep, thoughtful brown, and they held a story of such profound sadness that Wyatt felt an unwelcome flicker of something, not pity, but a disquieting sense of recognition. It was a look that seemed to see right through the rough exterior he presented to the world. For a long moment, he couldn't tear his gaze away. He simply tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Wyatt." "Clara," she replied, her voice soft but clear, not breaking under his intense scrutiny. The wagon ride to the ranch was a long one, filled with the sounds of the wheels crunching over dirt and the sighing of the wind. Words were few. Wyatt pointed out landmarks in a clipped, factual tone. "The Black Hills are yonder. That creek runs dry come August." Clara simply nodded, absorbing the immensity of her new world, the ranch house. When it came into view, was just as Wyatt had described it. A sturdy log cabin, built to withstand the elements, with a stone chimney and a wide, covered porch. It looked solid and lonely. The first days were a delicate, unspoken dance of two strangers learning to share a confined space. The house had only 2 rooms, a main living area that served as a kitchen and sitting room, and a small bedroom. Wyatt wordlessly surrendered the bedroom to her, setting up a cot for himself by the hearth. He was a creature of rigid routine, rising before the sun and working until dark. His presence was a large, silent weight in the small house. He was not unkind, but he was profoundly distant. He would issue instructions about the chores in the morning, and they would eat their meals in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Clara, though timid, was far from useless. She fell into the rhythm of the ranch with a quiet competence that surprised Wyatt. She cooked simple, hearty meals, mended his torn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and brought a sense of order to the cluttered shelves. She moved about the cabin with a soft-footed grace, her presence a gentle hum against the background of Wyatt's brooding silence. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she worked, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded dough. They were like 2 planets orbiting the same sun of survival, held in place by necessity, but never touching. Yet, there was a part of Clara that remained entirely hidden from him, a sanctuary of sorrow that she retreated to each night, long after Wyatt had settled onto his cot, feigning sleep. He would see it, a thin sliver of golden light appearing under her bedroom door. He knew she was awake, and he knew what she was doing. He could sometimes hear the faint scratch of a pen on paper, She was writing, always writing. By the light of a single candle, the ritual seemed to go on for hours. What secrets, what grief, was she pouring onto those pages? The flickering candlelight became a symbol of the mystery she was, a quiet beacon in the heart of his dark, orderly world. His soldier's instincts told him it was a vulnerability, a secret. The man in him, the one he thought had died with Sarah, was simply curious. But he never asked. He respected the closed door as he expected her to respect his. The uneasy truce of their coexistence was disturbed a few weeks into her stay. Wyatt was in the small, dusty supplies shed that leaned against the main cabin, taking inventory of his dwindling supplies for the coming winter. He needed to make a trip into town, and he was making a list. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, tucked behind a sack of dried beans. He found something that didn't belong. It was a small stack of envelopes, clean and white, and a bottle of ink. Beside them was a finished letter, sealed and ready to be posted. The handwriting was unmistakably Clara's. He didn't mean to pry, but his eyes snagged on the name of the town on the envelope. It was addressed to a post office box in New York. She had never mentioned writing to anyone. She had spoken of having no one left, of fleeing a past she wanted to forget. Why? Then, was she sending letters back to the very place she had run from? Wyatt stood there in the dusty dimness of the shed, the letter feeling heavy and foreign in his hand. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. He was a man who valued honesty and plain dealing above all else. He had offered this woman a new life, his name, the protection of his home. He had been direct and truthful with her from the start, but it seemed she had not offered him the same courtesy. She had brought secrets with her, secrets she guarded by candlelight and concealed behind sacks of beans. He placed the letter back where he found it, his movements stiff. The silence in the cabin that evening felt different. It was no longer just empty. It was charged with unspoken questions and the sharp, metallic taste of distrust. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the small cabin, a mournful echo of the storm now brewing within its walls. The spring that followed the long, hard winter did not arrive gently. It came in a fury, as if the sky itself meant to scour the land clean. The first sign was the change in the wind. Its lonely howl softened for a day, then returned with a wet, savage growl from the south. The horizon, once a crisp line of blue and brown, turned the color of a bruise. Clouds boiled up, thick and dark, swallowing the sun and plunging the plains into a premature twilight. When the rain began, it wasn't a drizzle, but a solid wall of water that hit the cabin's roof with the sound of 1,000 drumming fists. The dry, cracked earth, unable to drink so much so fast, turned to a thick, churning slurry of mud. The creek Wyatt relied on for his cattle swelled its banks, transforming from a placid stream into a roaring, muddy torrent that tore at the roots of the cottonwoods lining its edge. Wyatt secured the livestock in the newly rebuilt barn, his face a grim mask against the stinging rain. The sounds of the panicked animals a low thunder under the storm's roar. He and Clara worked in tandem, their movements efficient and unspoken, their world reduced to the immediate, violent present. It was in the heart of the deluge that a new sound cut through the storm. A thin, desperate cry. A new calf, born just that morning, had been separated from its mother. It was trapped in a low-lying patch of ground that was quickly becoming a small lake, its legs stuck fast in the sucking mud. Its mother bellowed from higher ground, helpless, before Wyatt could even shout a warning. Clara was out the cabin door and into the maelstrom. He watched, stunned, as she fought her way through the driving rain and ankle-deep mud, her skirts instantly soaked and heavy. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face as she reached the terrified animal. She was not a large woman, but she struggled with a primal determination, her hands digging into the cold mud around the calf's legs, her shoulders straining to free it. Wyatt, cursing under his breath, ran out to help her. By the time they wrestled the slick, shivering creature onto solid ground and guided it back to its mother, they were both drenched to the bone and shaking with cold. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a shock to their systems. Wyatt handed her a rough woolen blanket. "That was a fool thing to do," he said, his voice gruff, but without its usual cold edge. "I couldn't just leave it," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and battered, but it had taken its toll. Clara did not get out of bed. When Wyatt went to check on her, he found her shivering violently under a mountain of blankets, her skin burning with fever. Her face was flushed, and her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. The chill from the storm had settled deep in her lungs, a grim sense of dread, cold and familiar, settled over Wyatt. He had seen this before. He had sat in this very cabin, in this same chair, and watched another woman fight a fever. The memory of Sarah, her body weakened by a winter sickness years ago, rose like a ghost. He had felt so helpless then, a clumsy man trying to soothe a pain he couldn't touch. Now, that same helplessness washed over him. But this time, it was different. This time, there was no doctor to ride for, no one to turn to. There was only him. He pushed the memories down and went to work. He kept the fire roaring, brewed a bitter tea from willow bark as his father had taught him, and bathed Clara's face and wrists with cool water. For 2 days and 2 nights, he was a constant, silent presence at her bedside. The distance he had so carefully maintained between them evaporated in the sweltering heat of her fever. He had to lift her head to help her drink, had to listen to her muttered, delirious words that tumbled out in fragments, names he didn't know, pleas for forgiveness, whispers about a tattered letter and a man named Thomas. In those long, quiet hours, something in him cracked open. The simple, physical act of caring for her, of seeing her vulnerability laid bare, breached the walls he had built around his heart. Her hair, damp with sweat, clung to her temples, and he found himself gently brushing it back. Her hand, so capable and steady in her waking hours, felt small and fragile in his. He saw not the mail-order bride, the stranger with secrets, but a woman fighting for her life in his home. And as he watched her struggle, he felt the dull, aching throb of his own buried grief. He was tending not just to Clara, but to the memory of Sarah, giving a care he hadn't known how to give back then. It was a strange and painful penance. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Clara woke to find the world clear and quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window. She was weak, her body feeling hollowed out, but she was alive. Wyatt was sitting in the chair by her bed, asleep, his head slumped against his chest, in slumber. The harsh lines of his face were softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. A rifle lay across his lap. He had been watching over her all night. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fever spread through her chest. Later that afternoon, as Clara was sitting up and sipping a thin broth, a movement on the horizon caught Wyatt's eye. It was a figure, walking, stumbling with exhaustion across the muddy plains toward the ranch. It was a woman, alone. This was unheard of. No one traveled on foot in this territory unless they were desperate. Wyatt grabbed his rifle and went out onto the porch, his body tense, his eyes narrowed against the sun. As the woman drew closer, he could see she was young, not much more than a girl. Her dress, once of decent quality, was torn at the hem and stained with mud. Her hair was a wild tangle, and her face was pale and smudged with dirt. But it was her eyes that struck him. They were wide with a terror so profound it seemed she was seeing horrors right there in the empty landscape around her. She looked like a spooked doe fleeing a wolf pack. When she saw him on the porch with the rifle, she flinched but didn't stop. Her gaze was fixed on the cabin door, as if it were the only sanctuary in the world. "Clara!" the young woman cried out. her voice cracking with exhaustion and relief. "Is Clara here?" The name was a shock. Wyatt lowered the rifle slightly. At the sound of her name, Clara, still weak, had made her way to the doorway. Leaning against the frame for support, her face went ashen. "Evelyn?" she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. The young woman, Evelyn, collapsed at the foot of the porch steps. Sobbing, Clara, forgetting her own weakness, rushed forward and knelt beside her, gathering her into her arms. The two sisters clung to each other, a tableau of desperation and reunion in the stark Dakota sunlight. Wyatt stood frozen, a cold fury rising in his chest. It was a quiet, potent rage that eclipsed all other emotions. He had been deceived. Clara had told him she had no one. She had built their fragile arrangement on a foundation of lies. He felt like a fool. He had just spent 2 days nursing this woman, feeling the first stirrings of a dangerous sympathy. And all the while she had been hiding this, a sister, another secret. He waited until they were inside, until Evelyn had drunk a glass of water and the initial storm of emotion had passed. He stood by the hearth, his arms crossed, his face like stone. "You have some explaining to do," he said, his voice flat and hard. Clara flinched. "Wyatt, I can explain." "Can you?" he countered. "You told me you were alone." "I thought I was," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, I haven't seen her in over a year. I didn't know where she was. I thought I'd lost her." Evelyn, who was a younger, more fragile-looking version of her sister, looked up at Wyatt with those same haunted eyes. She was 22, but looked younger, worn down by whatever ordeal she had fled. "It's my fault," she whispered. "I ran away. They had me, kept me, at a home run by the church. After the trouble?" She stumbled over the words, her gaze darting around the room as if expecting judgment to fall from the rafters. "There was a scandal. A man. He was a deacon. He lied. No one believed me. They said I was a fallen woman, a temptress. They sent me away to repent." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He knew of such places, institutions where inconvenient women were sent to have their spirits broken in the name of God. "I had to get out," Evelyn continued, tears streaming down her face again. "I heard Clara had gone west. I didn't know where else to go. Please." She looked directly at Wyatt, her fear palpable. "Don't send me back. I'll work. I won't be a burden, just for a few days, just until I can figure out what to do." The cabin, which had already seemed small, now felt suffocating. It was filled with the ghosts of 3 broken pasts. Wyatt's anger warred with a grim sense of responsibility. He looked at Clara's pale, pleading face, and at Evelyn, who looked like she would shatter if he said a harsh word. He was trapped. To turn her out would be a death sentence. "A few days," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Then you find somewhere else to go." The days that followed were thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. The 3 of them moved around the small space like wary animals, careful not to brush against one another. Conversations were clipped and practical. Meals were eaten in a silence that was heavier and more fraught than ever before. Wyatt's coldness had returned, now sharpened with resentment. Clara was racked with guilt and fear, constantly trying to bridge the chasm that had opened between her and Wyatt, while also trying to comfort her traumatized sister. Evelyn, however, was a surprise. After a day of rest, she did not huddle in a corner as he expected. She rose early and insisted on helping. She was not as physically strong as Clara, but she was whip-smart and observant. She noticed the fence by the creek was loose before Wyatt did. She figured out how to mend a broken leather harness with a clever stitch he'd never seen before. When he was struggling with the ranch's financial ledger one evening, she glanced over his shoulder and quietly pointed out a mathematical error he had missed. He found himself watching her, perplexed. She was a bundle of contradictions. Her hands would tremble if he moved too quickly, but her eyes, when she was focused on a task, were sharp and intelligent. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were precise. She was nothing like the hysterical girl who had collapsed on his porch. This quiet competence, this keen-edged mind, was both unsettling and intriguing. He was used to Clara's gentle, unassuming capability. Evelyn's was different. It was sharper, more analytical, the intelligence of someone who had survived by her wits. The fragile, unspoken peace was shattered one night about a week after Evelyn's arrival. Wyatt couldn't sleep. The presence of two women in his house, of two distinct sets of secrets, was a constant irritant. He sat by the dying embers of the fire, the cabin lit only by the pale moonlight slanting through the window. From the bedroom, he could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching sound that had become so familiar. Clara, writing in her journal. After a time, the scratching stopped. The bedroom door creaked open, and Clara slipped out, likely heading to the outhouse. In the dim light, Wyatt saw that she had left the journal lying open on the small table beside her bed, a single candle still burning beside it. The temptation, which he had fought for weeks, was now overwhelming. His distrust, fueled by the lie about Evelyn, gnawed at him. He needed to know. He needed to understand what he had brought into his life. He moved silently across the room and stood over the table. The flickering candlelight illuminated Clara's neat, flowing script. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the page, trying to decipher the words that held her secrets. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was a low whisper, startling him. He spun around. Evelyn was standing in the shadows by the bedroom doorway, watching him. She hadn't gone to sleep. She was wrapped in a blanket, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "This is my house," Wyatt said, his voice a low growl of defiance. "And that is her soul," Evelyn countered, taking a step forward into the candlelight. Her eyes, which so often held fear, were now clear and steady, glinting with a surprising fire. "You think you have the right to look, because you gave her a roof? You think her secrets are part of the bargain?" He was taken aback by her directness, by the challenge in her tone. "She lied to me," he said, defending his actions. "People lie when they're afraid," Evelyn replied, her voice still a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You should know that. I see the way you look at that empty space by the fire. You're not the only one in this house who is haunted, Wyatt, but invading her pain won't do a thing to heal your own." He stared at her, speechless. She had seen right through him. She had seen his grief, his loneliness, and the anger he used to hide it all. In that moment, she was not a frightened girl, but a woman who understood the language of shadows as well as he did. A strange, unnerving connection sparked between them in the candlelight, a shared understanding of loss and survival. He stepped back from the table, away from the journal, his heart pounding. Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply walked over, gently closed the book, and blew out the candle, plunging the room back into near darkness. The quiet that settled over the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, complex, and dangerous awareness. Summer arrived on the plains not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering king. The bruised, battered landscape left by the spring storm underwent a miraculous transformation. The endless brown sea of mud and dormant grass gave way to a rolling ocean of green. So vibrant it hurt the eyes. Wildflowers erupted in audacious splashes of purple, yellow, and red, and the air, once thin and sharp with cold, grew thick and sweet with the scent of clover and warm earth. The sun baked the land, chasing away the last of the chill, and the days stretched out, long and golden. On Wyatt's ranch, this external rebirth mirrored a fragile, tentative peace, a routine, born of necessity, had settled over the three occupants of the small cabin. Wyatt rose with the sun, his boots hitting the floorboards with a familiar thud. Clara would already have the coffee brewing. moving with a quiet efficiency that was the bedrock of their domestic life. And Evelyn, no longer the terrified girl who had collapsed on their doorstep, had carved out her own place. She took to the outdoor work with a surprising aptitude, her sharp mind quickly grasping the logic of irrigation, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. There were moments, brief and shimmering, that felt almost like family. The three of them sitting on the porch after a long day's work, too tired for conversation, simply watching the sky bleed from orange to deep violet. A shared, spontaneous laugh when a clumsy calf tripped over its own feet. A quiet dinner where the silence felt companionable rather than strained. In these moments, Wyatt would look at the two sisters, Clara with her steady, calming presence, and Evelyn with her quick, fiery intelligence, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth would spread in his chest. He was no longer just a solitary man. His house was no longer just a shelter. It was, against all odds, becoming a home. But the peace was a thin layer of ice over a deep, turbulent river. The undercurrents of secrets and sorrows were always there, pulling at them. The charged awareness that had sparked between Wyatt and Evelyn in the candlelight had not faded. It had settled into a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their daily interactions. And Clara, though she had physically recovered from her illness, still carried a deep-seated weariness in her eyes. The house was too small, their pasts too large, for the peace to ever be absolute. The disruption came, as it often did, from the outside world. It arrived in a worn leather mail pouch slung over the shoulder of a rider making his monthly rounds. Wyatt had ridden into town for supplies and brought the mail back with him. There were 2 letters. One was for him, a bill of lading from a cattle buyer in Cheyenne. The other was addressed to Clara. The postmark was from New York. He handed it to her in the kitchen as she was washing the dinner dishes. The moment her eyes fell on the handwriting on the envelope, a subtle but immediate change came over her. The color drained from her face. Her hands, which were always so steady, trembled slightly as she took the letter. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron without a word, her movements furtive, as if she were concealing something illicit. But the shift in her demeanor was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. Evelyn, who was drying the dishes, stopped and looked from Clara's pale face to Wyatt's watchful one. The fragile peace of the evening shattered. That night, the ritual of the candle and the journal returned, but with a new and desperate intensity. Before, it had been a quiet, mournful practice. Now, it felt like a siege. Clara would disappear into the bedroom as soon as the evening meal was over, the door closing with a soft but definitive click. The sliver of light beneath it would burn for hours, long into the night. Sometimes, Wyatt and Evelyn, left alone in the main room, could hear the frantic scratching of her pen, a sound like a trapped animal trying to claw its way out. Other times, they heard the muffled sound of weeping. Clara emerged from these sessions hollow-eyed and withdrawn, erecting a wall of polite distance around herself that neither Wyatt nor Evelyn could breach. The easy camaraderie of their shared work vanished, replaced by a strained formality. Her isolation pushed Wyatt and Evelyn together, making them reluctant co-conspirators in their shared concern and confusion. They found themselves working side by side more and more often. Mending the long stretches of fence that bordered the property was a 2-person job. They would spend entire afternoons under the hot summer sun, their hands moving in a practiced rhythm, Wyatt digging the post holes and stretching the wire taut, Evelyn expertly fastening it with staples. The work was hard and physical, leaving little room for conversation, but it created a different kind of intimacy. It was an intimacy of shared space, of mutual reliance, of bodies moving in concert. He became acutely aware of her, the way the sun caught the gold flecks in her brown hair when she pushed it back from her forehead, the surprising strength in her slender arms as she helped him wrestle a new post into place, her scent, a mix of sunshine, sweat, and something uniquely her own, like wild herbs. Once, reaching for the same hammer, their hands brushed. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He looked up and saw a corresponding shock in her eyes, a flicker of heat that was quickly veiled. They didn't speak of it, but the air between them crackled with the unspoken acknowledgement. He found himself talking to her, truly talking, for the first time. He told her about his time in the cavalry, not the heroics, but the long, boring marches, the bitter cold of the winters, the strange bond between men facing death together. She, in turn, spoke of her love for books, of the world she had discovered in their pages while trapped in the stifling piety of the church home. She was sharp, witty, and her perspective on the world was unlike any he had ever encountered. She challenged his assumptions, debated his opinions, and sometimes she made him laugh, a real, deep laugh that surprised him with its rusty sound. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a confusing, exhilarating, and dangerous cocktail of admiration and desire. The tipping point came on a hot, breathless night in late July. A full moon hung in the inky sky, so bright it bleached the landscape of color, casting everything in silver and shadow. One of the mares was due to foal, and Wyatt had been checking on her every few hours. Just after midnight, he was heading out to the barn again when Evelyn appeared in the cabin doorway. "I'll come with you," she said softly. "I can't sleep." They walked to the barn in silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the narrow path. The air was thick and still, buzzing with the sound of crickets. Inside the barn, the air was warm and smelled of hay and horses. The mare was calm, resting on a deep bed of straw. They stood watching her for a long time, their shared vigil a comfortable one. "You're a good man, Wyatt," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice low in the quiet of the barn. He turned to look at her, in the moonlight slanting through the high barn window. Her face was a study in silver and shadow. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were open and luminous. "I'm not," he said, the words rough. "Good men don't have the thoughts I've been having." "About what?" she whispered, though she already knew. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, and in that look, she saw all the loneliness, the grief, and the fierce, forbidden longing he had kept locked away. He took a hesitant step closer, and she didn't move. The space between them became a humming, vibrant thing. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. Years of discipline, of self-imposed exile from all feeling, warred with a primal need that was so powerful it shook him to his core. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched her cheek. Her skin was softer than he could have imagined. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was all the invitation he needed. He lowered his head, his other hand finding her waist, pulling her toward him. Their lips were inches apart. The world narrowed to this single, incandescent moment, a moment that promised to burn away all the pain and loneliness. A crash from the house shattered the spell. It was the sound of breaking pottery, followed by a dull, heavy thud. They sprang apart, the moment broken, their hearts hammering with a mixture of frustrated desire and sudden alarm. "Clara," they said in unison. They ran back to the cabin. The door was ajar. On the kitchen floor, amidst the shards of a shattered water pitcher, lay Clara. She had fainted. Wyatt scooped her up in his arms. She felt terrifyingly light and carried her to the bed. Evelyn followed with a damp cloth and a lamp. When Clara's eyelids fluttered open a few moments later, her eyes were filled with a terrifying, bottomless despair. She looked at Wyatt, then at Evelyn, and a single, perfect tear rolled down her temple. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. "I'm so sorry." "It's the heat," Wyatt said gruffly, trying to impose some sort of order on the chaos. "You're not strong enough yet." But Clara shook her head, another tear following the first. "No," she said. "It's not the heat. It's the letter." She looked at Wyatt, her gaze unflinching. "It's about Thomas, the man I was to marry. They wrote that his family wants to clear his name. They found evidence. The man who accused him of theft confessed on his deathbed." Wyatt and Evelyn exchanged a confused look. This should be good news. "But that's not all," Clara continued, her voice gaining a strange, brittle strength. "They're digging into everything. All the old stories, all the secrets." She took a shuddering breath, and the words that followed came out in a torrent, as if a dam inside her had finally broken. "Before they took Thomas away," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a point on the ceiling. We were in love. We were going to be a family. I was with child." The confession hung in the air, sucking the oxygen from the room. Wyatt felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. "My family." Clara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion now, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "My father is a man of God, of reputation, a daughter with a child out of wedlock, whose intended was a convicted felon. It was an unbearable shame. They sent me away, not to an aunt in the country, to a private facility, a place for girls who had made mistakes." She closed her eyes, but the tears seeped out from beneath her lids. "They told me it was for my own good, to protect me, but it wasn't a home. It was a prison, and the doctor, he was not a kind man. He performed a procedure. He took my baby from me. He said it was God's will, to cleanse me of my sin." Her body began to shake with silent, racking sobs. "He told me afterward that there had been complications, that the damage was done, that I would never be able to carry another child, ever." The final words landed in the silence of the room with devastating force. Wyatt looked at this woman, who had cooked his meals and mended his clothes, who wrote in her journal by candlelight, and saw her for the first time. He saw the unimaginable depth of the pain she carried, the horror she had survived. His anger, his suspicion over her secrets, seemed petty and shameful now. All he felt was a vast, aching wave of compassion that was so intense it felt like a physical pain in his own chest. He looked over at Evelyn, who was kneeling by the bed, holding her sister's hand, her own face a mask of grief and fury. He saw them not as two separate women, but as a single unit, bound together by a shared history of suffering at the hands of a cruel and judgmental world. And in that terrible, clarifying moment, he understood the truth of his own heart, his feelings, the protective tenderness he felt for Clara, the sharp, intelligent desire he felt for Evelyn, were not separate things. They were tangled together, inextricable. He had not let one woman into his life. He had let in a world of pain and resilience, and his heart, against all logic and reason, had opened itself to both. The air in the cabin was no longer just tense. It was alive, humming with the impossible. The glances that now passed between the three of them were a new and dangerous language. In Clara's eyes, there was raw, exposed vulnerability. In Evelyn's, a fierce protectiveness mixed with the memory of a stolen kiss. And in Wyatt's, a dawning, terrifying realization of a love that defied every rule he had ever known. The long, hot summer night pressed in around them, pregnant with the weight of confession, the ghost of a lost child, and the forbidden promise of a future no one could have ever imagined. The fuse had been lit. The fragile truce forged by Clara's confession was as delicate as a spider's web in the morning mist. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken things, charged with a new, terrifying intimacy. They moved around each other with a heightened awareness, a shared knowledge that had no name. The glances between Wyatt and Evelyn were fraught with the memory of what almost was, while his gaze upon Clara was now filled with a deep, protective tenderness that was almost painful to behold. They were three solitary souls, trapped in an impossible orbit, held together by a gravity of shared pain and burgeoning, forbidden affection. It was a state that could not last. The world, with its rigid rules and harsh judgments, was bound to intrude. It came in the form of 5 men on horseback. They were drifters, the kind that washed up on the fringes of civilization, their face hard bitten by the sun and cheap whiskey, their eyes holding a restless, predatory gleam. They rode into the small, dusty town that served as the territory's hub and proceeded to drink the saloon dry, their boisterousness quickly souring into aggression. Wyatt had ridden into town for salt and flour, his mind on the quiet, complicated world of his ranch. He was leaving the general store when the trouble found him. One of the drifters, a burly man with a tangled red beard, stumbled out of the saloon and blocked his path. "Well now, look what we have here," the man slurred, his eyes taking in Wyatt's stoic demeanor and worn but well-kept gear. "A real sodbuster. Think you're better than us, do you? Living out on your patch of dirt like a king." Wyatt said nothing. He simply tried to step around the man. Years in the cavalry had taught him that a fight avoided was a fight won, but the man was looking for a target for his drunken rage, and Wyatt's silence was like a red flag to a bull. He shoved Wyatt hard in the chest. "I'm talking to you," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. The other 4 drifters spilled out of the saloon, sensing a bit of sport. They formed a loose, menacing circle. The townspeople, who had been going about their business, quickly vanished into doorways, their faces becoming pale blurs behind window panes. Wyatt's body went rigid. The old instincts, the ones he had tried to bury under years of hard labor, surged to the surface. He felt the familiar, cold calm settle over him. He measured the distance between the men, noted the positions of their hands, the way they were balanced on their feet. "I don't want any trouble," Wyatt said, his voice low and even, a warning bell in the tense silence. "Too late for that," the leader sneered, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. It happened fast. The man drew his gun, but he was slow, his movements clumsy with drink. Wyatt moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he lunged forward, his left hand clamping down on the man's wrist, twisting it violently so the gun pointed at the sky. His right fist, hard as a block of wood, slammed into the man's jaw. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. The big man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The other 4 paused for a split second, stunned by the sudden turn of events. That was all the time Wyatt needed. He kicked the fallen man's pistol into the dust and squared off against the others, but these were not soldiers. They were barroom brawlers. One of them lunged, swinging a wild punch. Wyatt ducked under it, driving his shoulder into the man's gut, sending him gasping to his knees. Another pulled a knife. As he rushed in, Wyatt caught his arm, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and send him crashing into one of his companions. The last man, seeing the fight was lost, finally managed to clear his own gun from its holster. He fired, the shot deafening in the narrow street. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Wyatt's left arm, a searing, white-hot line of pain. Wyatt grunted, stumbling back a step, but his eyes never left his opponent. The drifter, panicked, fumbled to cock his pistol for another shot. It was in that moment that a new voice, clear and sharp with command, cut through the air. "Drop it, now!" Everyone froze. Standing at the edge of the street, not 20 feet away, was Evelyn. She held Wyatt's spare rifle, the one he always kept in a scabbard on his saddle. She must have ridden in after him, perhaps on a pretense of needing something from the store. The rifle was pressed tight against her shoulder, the barrel steady, her eyes sighted down its length. There was no fear on her face, only a cold, deadly focus that Wyatt had never seen before. Her previous life might have been one of books and fear, but something in her had been forged into steel by the hardships of the West. The last drifter, Seeing the unwavering resolve in her eyes, wisely let his pistol fall to the ground. The fight was over. The town's sheriff, who had been conspicuously absent, finally appeared, and with the help of a few newly brave townsmen, the drifters were rounded up. Evelyn rushed to Wyatt's side, her composure cracking as she saw the blood soaking through his sleeve. "You're hurt," she breathed, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "It's just a graze," he said through gritted teeth, though the pain was beginning to throb in earnest. "Let me see," she insisted, her tone shifting again, becoming practical and authoritative. She gently tore the sleeve of his shirt. The bullet had passed clean through, leaving a ragged wound that was bleeding profusely. "We need to clean this and stitch it, now." She led him into the back room of the general store, ignoring the stunned and curious stares of the onlookers. She sent the storekeeper for hot water, carbolic acid, and his wife's sewing kit. As she worked, her hands were deft and sure. She cleaned the wound with an unflinching precision that amazed him, her touch gentle but firm. She explained in a low voice that she had spent 2 years assisting a country doctor back east, a man who believed a woman's mind was not too delicate for the study of anatomy. It was a part of her past she had never spoken of. She stitched the wound with small, neat sutures, her brow furrowed in concentration. As she worked, her head was bent close to his, and he could feel her breath on his skin, smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. The intimacy of the moment, in the dusty, lamp-lit room, was more potent than the kiss they had almost shared in the barn. He was not just a man she desired. He was a man she was determined to save. By the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting. But the events of the day were far from over. Their dramatic appearance in town, the lone rancher living with 2 women, one of whom had faced down a gunman and then stitched his wound like a seasoned doctor, had lit a fuse. Tongues were wagging. The story spread like a prairie fire, changing and growing with each telling. By the time the circuit preacher, Reverend Miller, heard it, Wyatt was not a homesteader defending himself, but a lawless sinner living in a den of iniquity with his 2 wives. The Reverend arrived at the ranch 2 days later, accompanied by 2 of the town's elders. They rode up to the cabin, their faces set in grim, judgmental lines. Wyatt met them on the porch. Clara and Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, silent shadows. "Mr. Wyatt," the Reverend began, his voice oozing a righteous authority. "We have come on a matter of grave concern. There are rumors, stories circulating about the living arrangement in this household." "What business is it of yours?" Wyatt asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is the Lord's business," one of the elders interjected. "It is an affront to God and man. The Holy Bible is clear on the sanctity of marriage. 1 man, 1 woman. What you are doing here, it is an abomination." "What I am doing here," Wyatt said, his gaze as hard as granite, "is providing a home for 2 women who had nowhere else to go. I am protecting them. What you are doing is standing on my land and casting judgment on things you do not understand." "We understand the nature of sin, sir," Reverend Miller said, puffing out his chest. "We are here to warn you, to call you to repentance. You must cast one of these women out. You must choose a wife and send the other away, lest you bring damnation down upon this house and this entire community." "The only sin I see here," Wyatt replied, his hand resting on the porch post, not far from the axe that was leaning there, "is 3 men who have ridden a long way to stick their noses in matters that do not concern them. This is my home. These are my people. I will thank you to leave." There was no arguing with the cold dismissal in his voice. The men, flustered and indignant, mounted their horses and rode off, shouting back warnings of hellfire and damnation. Wyatt watched them go. His shoulders slumped. The world he had tried to keep at bay had breached his defenses. The pressure was no longer a distant threat. It was a siege. The Reverend's visit left a poisonous residue in the cabin, the unspoken tension between the 3 of them. once a complex web of affection and desire, was now twisted with the ugly threads of guilt and public shame. Clara, in particular, seemed to crumble under the weight of it. She grew quieter, more withdrawn. The memory of being judged and cast out by her own family now resurrected in this new life. A few days later, she announced she was riding into town for supplies. It wasn't unusual, but there was a strange, determined set to her jaw that worried Evelyn. Later that afternoon, Evelyn, driven by a gnawing unease, saddled her own horse and followed. She found Clara not in the general store, but in the small mercantile at the other end of town, the one that sold fabrics and clothing, through the window. Evelyn watched in disbelief as Clara stood before a bolt of simple white cotton, her hand stroking the fabric, her face a mask of heartbreaking resolve. She was buying material for a wedding dress. Evelyn waited for her on the trail back to the ranch. When Clara rode up, the package wrapped in brown paper tied to her saddle. Evelyn blocked her path. "What did you do, Clara?" Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Clara wouldn't meet her eyes. "I bought what was needed." "Needed for what? A wedding? Whose wedding?" Evelyn's voice rose, sharp with betrayal. "Are you just going to pretend, to pick one of us and throw the other away? Just like the preacher said, is that what this has come to?" "What choice do we have?" Clara cried, her composure finally breaking. Her voice was raw with anguish. "Did you not hear them? Did you not see the way they look at us? They will destroy us. Evelyn, they will call you a harlot and me a sinner, and they will run him out of this territory. I am his intended. I came here to be his wife. It is the only way to make this right." "Right for who?" Evelyn shot back, her horse dancing nervously beneath her. "Right for the gossips in town, for the preacher. What about what's right for us? For him, do you think he will be happy, living a lie? Do you think I can just watch you two marry, knowing what I feel, knowing what he feels?" "What he feels is his duty," Clara insisted, tears streaming down her face. "And a fondness for us both. But this thing between the three of us, it is impossible. It is a dream. I am trying to save us from the nightmare that will come when we wake up." "This isn't about saving us, Clara. This is about your own guilt," Evelyn accused, her own pain making her cruel. "You've spent your whole life being told you are a sinner, and you believe it. You'd rather sacrifice yourself, and me, and him, than live one day with a happiness you don't think you deserve." "And you?" Clara retorted, her eyes flashing. "You would rather we all be burned at the stake than give up 1 ounce of what you want? Is that love, Evelyn, or is it just selfishness?" The words hung between them, brutal and unforgivable. They stared at each other. Two sisters who had survived so much together, now torn apart by an impossible love. Without another word, Clara spurred her horse, galloping past Evelyn and back toward the ranch, leaving Evelyn alone on the trail with the dust and the bitter taste of their argument. That evening, when Wyatt returned from checking on the northern pasture, the cabin was eerily quiet, but it wasn't dark. The kitchen was filled with a soft, flickering glow. Dozens of candles, the same kind Clara used for her nightly writing, were lit and placed on every available surface: the table, the mantel, the window sills. The room seemed to be floating in a warm, golden light. Clara was sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a simple dress of plain white cotton, freshly sewn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes large and luminous with unshed tears. Then, a movement from the shadows. Evelyn stepped forward. She, too, was wearing a simple white dress, almost identical to her sister's. She came to stand beside Clara, her face pale but resolute. Wyatt stood frozen in the doorway, his heart beginning to pound. He looked from one woman to the other, at their pale, determined faces, at the strange, ceremonial light that filled the room. He knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that his life was about to be irrevocably changed. It was Clara who spoke, her voice trembling but clear in the candlelit silence. She looked directly at Wyatt. "We both love you." "Wyatt," she said, and the simple, direct statement was more powerful than any weapon. "And I think, in your own way, you have come to care for us both." She took a shuddering breath. "I can't live like this anymore. The whispers, the judgment, the lie in our own hearts. It's tearing us all apart." Her gaze flickered to her sister. "I can go. I will go. I will disappear. And you and Evelyn can have a life together. You can have the life that society will accept." She paused, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I will do that, unless you tell the truth tonight, unless you speak what is truly in your heart, no matter how impossible it is." Wyatt's world tilted on its axis. He looked at Clara, offering him sacrifice. He looked at Evelyn, her eyes silently pleading with him to be brave. He saw their pain, their love, their courage, and he felt the last of his own carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. Slowly, he walked to the table. He picked up an unlit candle. His hand was shaking, but he managed to light it from one of the others. He placed it deliberately in the center of the table, a single, steady flame between the three of them. He looked at them, his gaze encompassing them both, holding them both. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. "I was dead," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "When Sarah died, the man I was died with her. I was just a ghost, working this land, waiting for my own time to be buried in it." He looked at Clara. "And then you came. You brought a quiet and a strength this house hadn't known. You woke up a part of me I thought was gone forever." He turned his gaze to Evelyn. "And then you came with a fire and a mind that challenged me, and a courage that shamed me. You made me feel alive again." He took a deep, ragged breath, the confession finally breaking free. "I don't know what the rules of God or men say. I don't care anymore. All I know is that I was dead. Until you two walked into this house." The silence that followed was absolute. Then a sob broke from Clara. Evelyn stepped forward, and then all three of them were moving at once. They met in the middle of the room, a tangle of arms and bodies, clinging to each other. Wyatt's arms went around both of them, pulling them tight against him, his face buried in their hair. They were no longer two sisters and one man. They were simply three survivors, three lost souls who had found an impossible sanctuary in each other. They stood there for a long time, held together in the warm, flickering light of the candles, their embrace a silent, desperate, and beautiful vow in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The morning after the candlelit confession dawned crisp and clear, the air scrubbed clean by the night. Inside the cabin, the world had been remade. The air was no longer thick with unspoken tensions and secret sorrows, but with the quiet, fragile, and terrifying reality of their shared vow. There was no easy path forward, no map for the territory they had just entered. They were three castaways on a small, wooden island, with a vast, judgmental sea of the world stretching out in every direction. They did not speak of love that morning. The word was too small, too conventional for the complex, powerful thing that now bound them together. Instead, they spoke of survival. Over a breakfast of coffee and biscuits, a silent pact was made. They would sever their ties to the town. No more trips for supplies unless absolutely necessary. And then only Wyatt would go, quickly and quietly. No more friendly nods to passing riders. No more pretense of being a part of the community that had already condemned them. The ranch would become their entire world, a fortress against the whispers and the righteousness of others. It was a self-imposed exile, a decision born of the understanding that the only way to protect their impossible sanctuary was to draw up the bridge and bolt the door. A new rhythm began, a life redesigned around the reality of three. It was a dance of practicality and profound emotional negotiation. Clara, with her innate gift for creating order and comfort, took command of the domestic sphere, The cabin became her domain, a place of warmth, the scent of baking bread, and neatly mended clothes. She was the anchor, the quiet center around which their tumultuous lives revolved. Her work was the steady, gentle pulse of their home. Evelyn, restless and sharp-edged, could not be contained by four walls. She claimed the outdoors as her own. She rode with Wyatt, her mind quick to grasp the intricate calculus of ranching. She learned to read the sky for weather, the tracks in the dirt for predators, the subtle signs of sickness in the herd. She was a natural with the horses, her touch both gentle and firm. She and Wyatt worked as partners, a seamless unit of shared labor and unspoken understanding. The division of their world was not a wall between the sisters, but a bridge. Evelyn would come in from the fields, tired and dusty, and Clara would have a hot meal waiting. Clara would speak of a leaking roof, and Evelyn would know exactly how to fix it. They were two halves of a whole, each providing what the other lacked, their strengths weaving together to create a fabric strong enough to sustain their new reality. The nights were the most complex part of their new life. The small bedroom, which had once been a symbol of Clara's separateness, now became a shared space of solace. There was no rigid schedule, no spoken agreement. It was a fluid, intuitive arrangement guided by a deep and sensitive awareness of one another's needs. Some nights, Wyatt would find Clara waiting for him, her quiet presence a balm to his soul, their connection one of gentle tenderness and shared history. On other nights, it would be Evelyn, her fiery spirit a thrilling counterpoint to his own stoicism, their passion a fierce affirmation of life in the face of a world that wished to deny them. Sometimes, after a particularly hard day, one of the sisters would find the other already there with Wyatt, and she would not leave. On those nights, they would simply be together, the three of them, finding comfort not in passion, but in presence. They would lie in the darkness, talking softly, sharing stories of their pasts, the ghosts of Sarah and Thomas and the lost child finally allowed to rest in a space of shared, unconditional acceptance. They were not two women competing for one man. They were a family, inventing its own rules, healing its own wounds in the deep, quiet dark. The bed was not a place of sin, as the preacher would have called it. It was an altar, a place of healing, where three broken people were slowly, painstakingly, making themselves whole. Autumn came, and it set the plains on fire. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, their leaves raining down to create a carpet of light on the dark water. The prairie grasses faded from green to a rich, burnished bronze, rippling in the wind like a field of molten metal. The sky took on a new clarity, a deep, piercing blue that made the vastness of the landscape feel both beautiful and melancholy. It was a season of breathtaking beauty, a final, defiant blaze of glory before the long, white death of winter. For the three of them, the season was a perfect mirror of their lives. Their days were filled with the hard, rewarding work of the harvest and preparing for the coming cold. There was a richness to their life together, a vibrancy that none of them had ever known. They were living with an intensity that felt as brilliant and fleeting as the autumn leaves. But just like the season, they knew it was fragile. The chill in the morning air was a constant reminder of the hardship to come, a warning that the world outside their golden sanctuary was growing colder, harder, and more unforgiving. The beauty of their life was inseparable from the danger that surrounded it. The danger, when it came, had a name: Reverend Miller. He was not a man to be deterred by a single dismissal. Wyatt's defiance had not shamed him. It had stoked the fires of his righteousness. In Wyatt's rejection of his authority, the Reverend saw not a man protecting his family, but a sinner hardening his heart against God. For weeks, he preached from his pulpit about the den of iniquity that festered in their midst, a cancer on the soul of the community. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of divine retribution, of the duty of good Christian folk to tear out sin by its very roots. He was a skilled orator, and his words found fertile ground in the fears and prejudices of the townspeople, many of whom led hard. narrow lives and found a strange comfort in directing their frustrations at an easy target. He chose a Sunday to make his move. After a particularly fiery sermon, he led a procession out of the church. It was not a mob in the traditional sense. Not yet. It was a congregation. A crowd of about 20 men and a few women, their Sunday finery looking strangely out of place as they rode and walked the dusty trail to Wyatt's ranch. They carried no ropes or torches, but they carried something far more dangerous, the unshakable conviction of their own moral superiority. They saw themselves as soldiers of God on a holy crusade. Wyatt, Evelyn, and Clara saw them coming from a long way off, a dark cloud of dust on the horizon. There was no question as to their purpose. Wyatt immediately went into the cabin and came out with his cavalry rifle. Evelyn followed, her own face pale but set, holding the spare rifle she had used once before. "Go inside, both of you," Wyatt commanded, his voice a low growl. "No," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. She came to stand beside him on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her. Evelyn took up a position on his other side. They would face this together. The crowd came to a halt just beyond the fence line, a safe distance from the rifle in Wyatt's hands. Reverend Miller urged his horse forward, positioning himself as the spokesman. "Wyatt," he called out, his voice booming across the yard. "We have not come for violence. We have come to offer you one final chance to repent, to cleanse this house of its filth. Send out the 2 women, and we will pray for your soul." Wyatt took a step forward, the rifle held loosely in one hand, but his presence was an iron wall. "There is no filth in this house, Reverend," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "There is only decency and hard work. The only filth I see is in the minds of men who would ride to a man's home to terrorize his family." "Family?" the Reverend scoffed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You call this abomination a family? You live in sin with 2 women. You shame the name of marriage. You are a blight on this land." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. They were growing bolder, feeding on the preacher's righteous anger. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He raised his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the men he had once considered his neighbors. "I will say this only once," he said, his voice dropping to a level that was more menacing than any shout. "The women in this house are under my protection. I consider them my wives, both of them. And if any man here thinks he can set one foot on my property with harm in his heart, I will send him to meet his Maker, and I will not lose a moment's sleep over it." The raw, unequivocal threat hung in the air, stunning the crowd into silence. The declaration, "my wives, both of them," was a direct, shocking challenge to their entire moral universe. But before the Reverend could formulate a response, another voice spoke. It was Clara. She took a tentative step forward, her hands trembling, but her back was straight. All eyes turned to her. She was the mail-order bride, the catalyst for this whole affair. "Please," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried a desperate plea that made people listen. "Please, before you cast your judgment, let me tell you my story." She looked out at the faces before her, hard, weathered, and closed. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from Wyatt on her left and Evelyn on her right. And then she began to speak. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "I came here from New York. I came here because I had lost everything. I was to be married to a good man, a man I loved with all my heart. His name was Thomas." She told them about the false accusation, about his conviction, about the shame that had fallen on her family. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she did not stop. "I came west because I was promised a new life," she continued, "a life of quiet dignity, away from the whispers and the pointing fingers. I came to this man's house," she gestured to Wyatt, "as his intended, but I carried a secret with me, a secret of a pain so deep I thought it would kill me." And then, in a voice raw with a grief that was still achingly fresh, She told them about her child. She told them about being sent away, about the cold, sterile room, about the doctor who had taken her baby and her future from her in the name of cleansing her of sin. She did not spare them the details. She spoke of her shame, her despair, and the belief that she was forever damaged, forever unworthy of love or happiness. As she spoke, a profound change began to ripple through the crowd. The hard, judgmental expressions began to soften. These were not city folk. They were people who understood loss. They had buried children in this hard land. They had seen their crops fail and their dreams turn to dust. They understood pain, even if they had never known this specific kind. "This man," Clara said, her voice thick with tears as she looked at Wyatt, "took me in. He did not know my story, but he gave me shelter. He was a good and decent man, though he carried his own grief. And then my sister came." She reached out and took Evelyn's hand. "She was fleeing her own judgment, her own false accusations. He gave her shelter, too. He protected us. He was kind to us." She looked back at the crowd, her eyes pleading. "We are not an abomination. We are three people who have been broken by the world you believe in. And here, in this small house, we have found a way to piece ourselves back together. We have found kindness. We have found acceptance. We have found a home." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper again. "Is that such a terrible sin?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind sighing through the prairie grass. The Reverend opened his mouth to speak, to counter her emotional plea with a stern verse of scripture, but he never got the chance. From the back of the crowd, a woman began to cry. It was not loud, dramatic sobbing, but a quiet, heartbreaking sound of profound empathy. She was Martha, the wife of one of the farmers, a plain, careworn woman who rarely spoke. She had come to the territory 5 years earlier, a mail-order bride herself, for a man who had taken one look at her plain face and sent her back on the next train. She had been saved from utter destitution only by her current husband, a kind widower who had taken pity on her. She, more than anyone, understood the terror of being alone and judged. Her tears were a contagion of doubt, one by one. The men began to shift uncomfortably. They looked at their feet, at the horizon, anywhere but at the three people on the porch or at the weeping woman in their midst. Clara's story had not just been a story. It had been a mirror. In it, they saw their own vulnerabilities, their own secret sorrows, their own fears of being cast out. The righteous certainty that had propelled them here began to crumble, leaving behind a bitter residue of shame. One farmer turned his horse without a word and began to ride away. Then another and another. The Holy Crusade had become an embarrassing spectacle. Soon, only Reverend Miller and his two most zealous elders remained, looking foolish and abandoned. With a final, venomous glare, the Reverend wheeled his horse around and galloped off, defeated not by a rifle, but by a story. Wyatt, Clara, and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching them go until they were nothing more than a smudge of dust in the distance. They had not moved. They were still holding hands. They had faced the world, and for one brief, astonishing moment, they had won. But as the silence of the prairie settled around them once more, they knew the truth. The crowd had dispersed, but the prejudice had not. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the long, cold winter to come. Winter came not as a slow decline, but as an invasion. It swept down from the north with a fury, a great white beast that devoured the landscape and silenced the world under a thick blanket of snow. The brilliant colors of autumn were a distant memory, buried and forgotten. The wind, no longer a sighing breeze, became a constant, shrieking banshee, clawing at the logs of the cabin and piling drifts of snow as high as the windows. The world shrank, its vast horizons collapsing until it consisted of only the four walls of the cabin, the nearby barn, and the treacherous, snow-filled path that connected them. For Wyatt, Clara, and Evelyn, this self-imposed exile became a physical reality. They were truly cut off, their small ranch an island in a frozen white ocean. The siege they had feared had come, not in the form of angry men, but in the form of nature's brutal indifference. But instead of breaking them, the isolation forged them into something stronger. Their lives became a tightly woven braid of interdependence. They were a self-contained unit, a world of three against the cold. Their days were measured by the rhythm of survival. They rose in the pre-dawn darkness, the cold floorboards a shock to their bare feet. Their time was spent tending to the animals, who huddled together for warmth in the barn, their breath misting in the frigid air. They chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a defiant heartbeat against the howling wind. They melted snow for water, rationed their supplies, and huddled around the stone hearth, its roaring fire the warm, beating heart of their home. In the long, dark evenings, trapped inside by the storm, they shared more than just food and warmth. They shared themselves. The carefully guarded vaults of their pasts were finally opened. Wyatt spoke of his childhood on this very land, of a father made hard by circumstance and a mother whose laughter he barely remembered. He spoke of the camaraderie and the senselessness of the war, filling in the gaps he had left before. Evelyn, in turn, spoke of the life she had imagined for herself, a life of learning and medicine, and of the bitter injustice that had stolen it from her. And Clara, her voice soft in the firelight, read to them. She did not read from a published book, but from the pages of her own journal. She read of her love for Thomas, of her hopes, of the crushing grief, and of the long, slow journey out of the darkness. The candlelight no longer illuminated a secret ritual of sorrow. It illuminated a shared history, a testament to their collective healing. In that small, warm cabin, surrounded by the vast, frozen emptiness, they created a sanctuary of absolute trust. It was during these long, quiet weeks that Clara finally completed her manuscript. She had taken the chaotic, pain-filled entries of her journal and woven them into a single, powerful narrative. It was the story of a woman's fall and her slow, arduous climb back to life. Writing it had been an act of survival. Finishing it was an act of hope, with hands that trembled only slightly. She wrapped the thick stack of pages in oilcloth and brown paper. On his next, and likely last, trip to town before the deepest part of winter set in, Wyatt posted the package. It was addressed to a small, independent publisher in Boston that Evelyn had read about, a firm known for taking chances on unconventional stories. As the package disappeared into the mail pouch, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense that she had finally given her ghost a voice and sent it out into the world, freeing herself from its haunting. Evelyn, too, found a new purpose blooming in their isolation. The confrontation with the townsfolk had shown her that fear and ignorance were the true enemies. While Wyatt was in town, he had been quietly approached by Martha, the farmer's wife who had wept during Clara's speech, her eldest boy. She confessed, was 10 years old and couldn't read his own name. There were others. She said, children from poor, outlying farms who had no access to a school. She asked if Evelyn, who she'd heard was a learned woman, might be willing to help. And so, a school was born. Twice a week, weather permitting. A small group of bundled-up children would make the trek to the ranch. They would sit on the floor of the main room, their faces scrubbed and earnest in the firelight. While Evelyn taught them their letters and numbers, she was a natural teacher, patient and engaging, her sharp mind able to make the driest lesson interesting. The children adored her. Through them, a fragile bridge began to form between the ranch and the outside world. The parents, who sent their children with small gifts of smoked meat or preserved vegetables, no longer saw the ranch as a den of sin, but as a place of unexpected kindness. They still didn't understand the life within its walls, but they were beginning to respect the people who lived there. The winter wore on, relentless and unforgiving. One afternoon, as a brief break in the storms allowed for a patch of pale, watery sunlight, Wyatt rode out to check on a section of fence near the frozen creek. The ground was treacherous, a thin layer of fresh snow hiding sheets of black ice. His horse, usually so sure-footed, suddenly lost its footing. The animal went down with a panicked whinny, and Wyatt was thrown clear. He landed hard, his head striking a partially exposed rock with a sickening crack. For a moment, the world was a kaleidoscope of white snow and black sky, and then it was nothing at all. When he didn't return by dusk, the sisters knew something was wrong. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the calm of their domestic routine, bundled against the biting cold, carrying lanterns that cast eerie, dancing shadows on the snow. They followed his tracks. They found him lying still and pale beside his horse, which stood over him, shivering and nickering softly. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare of desperate, straining effort. He was a dead weight, and they were not strong enough to lift him onto his horse. They had to fashion a makeshift travois from fallen branches and their own shawls, dragging him across the frozen, uneven ground. Every jolt, every stumble sent a fresh wave of terror through them. By the time they got him inside and onto his bed, they were exhausted, their bodies aching, their hearts hammering with a fear so profound it was paralyzing. He was alive, but only just. A long, ugly gash ran along his scalp, and a fever was already beginning to burn through him. For the next week, the world ceased to exist outside the walls of the bedroom. Day and night blurred into a single, continuous vigil. They moved like ghosts, their faces pale with exhaustion, their lives reduced to a series of desperate tasks, keeping the fire blazing, melting snow, brewing willow bark tea, bathing his hot skin, and praying. They prayed to a God they weren't sure they still believed in, making desperate bargains with the universe for the life of the man who was their anchor, their protector, their love. The fear of losing him was a physical presence in the room, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush them. In that fear, they discovered the absolute, terrifying depth of their need for him, and for each other. They were no longer two women and one man. They were a single, three-part soul, and one part was threatening to tear away. Wyatt drifted in a red-tinged sea of pain and memory. He was back in the war, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. He was standing before the burning barn, the heat scorching his face, helpless as the flames consumed his world. But through the fevered haze, he was aware of gentle hands on his brow, of a soft voice whispering his name, of the cool relief of water on his parched lips. He fought his way toward those sensations, toward the pinpricks of light in his long darkness. In his delirium, he spoke. His words were a jumble of disconnected phrases, fragments of his life rising to the surface. But sometimes, a moment of clarity would break through. Once, as Clara was changing the bandage on his head, his eyes flickered open, unfocused, and he whispered, "Clara, my quiet heart, you saved me." A few hours later, as Evelyn was spooning broth between his lips, his hand twitched, trying to find hers. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "My fire, you make me brave." He smiled then, a faint, peaceful expression that seemed utterly disconnected from his broken body. He did not know he was speaking aloud. He was simply in a place where the truth was the only language, and in that place, he gave them both the reassurance they so desperately needed, confirming that his heart had room enough, and love enough, for them both. He woke up slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. The first thing he was aware of was the slant of weak morning light across his face. The second was the profound stillness of the room. He felt weak, his body a collection of aches and pains, but his mind was clear. The fever was gone. He turned his head, a slow, stiff movement. The sight that met his eyes would be forever burned into his memory. Curled up in a chair beside his bed were Clara and Evelyn. They had fallen asleep there, utterly spent. They were leaning against each other for support, their faces smudged with soot and exhaustion, but peaceful in their slumber. and their hands were clasped together, their fingers intertwined in a gesture of shared ordeal and unbreakable solidarity. He looked at them, this impossible family he had forged in the heart of the wilderness. He saw their strength, their courage, their fierce, unwavering loyalty, and he felt a wave of love so powerful, so profound. It was like the sun rising inside him, chasing away the last of the shadows. He was weak, broken, and had almost died. But as he lay there, watching the two women who were his entire world, he knew he was the most fortunate man alive. They lived. That, in the end, was their quiet victory. They survived the winter, and the long, slow thaw that followed. They lived through the town's lingering disapproval, which eventually softened into a kind of grudging, head-shaking acceptance. They lived through hardship and sickness and the small, beautiful joys of a life built on its own terms. They needed no title, no license, no blessing from a preacher to validate their bond. Their family was real because their love was real, built on a foundation of shared trust and mutual respect that was stronger than any law of God or man. The story ends, as it must, with the coming of spring. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping, green earth beneath. The creek thawed and began to run again, its voice a happy murmur. In the pasture, the first of the new foals took its wobbly first steps, a promise of renewal, of life continuing. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of soft pink and gold, Clara stood on the porch. The air was cool and sweet with the smell of damp earth. She held a single, unlit candle in her hand. She went back inside, to the kitchen where it had all begun. She did not need to light dozens of candles anymore. The house was already full of light. She lit the one candle and placed it in the center of the table. It wasn't a light against the darkness of secrets, or a beacon for a desperate confession. It was a small, steady flame of remembrance, a quiet celebration of the night three broken people had chosen to become whole, together. The flame flickered, casting a warm, gentle glow on the peaceful home they had built, a testament to a love as wild, as resilient, and as beautiful as the land itself. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the frontier. And please, share your thoughts on the story of Wyatt, Clara, and Evelyn.